Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Jim Allen about urban food forests for part 2 of our mini-series on agroforestry. Food forests are multi-level environments where fruit and nut trees, vegetables, shade trees, mushrooms, aquatic plants, and more can all exist in the same urban or rural space. They're known to have many benefits, both environmentally and socially. However, in more arid climates like the American Southwest, there are a few hurdles urban agroforesters must overcome. In this episode, Jim discusses a recent survey of southwestern food forests and how these mini oases are learning to thrive in more arid climates. Make sure to stick around to the end of the show for our next student spotlight as well. We'll talk more about all that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is Gasmet Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers and ruminant emissions. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's Gasmet spelled G-A-S-M-E-T, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everybody, welcome to the show. Today we have Jim Allen with us. Jim is a professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University and served as its executive director from 2007 to 2021. Prior to his arrival at NAU in 2006, he served for 6 years as the dean of the forestry division at Paul Smith College in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. He also worked as a research ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Louisiana and for the U.S. Forest Service in Hawaii. Dr. Allen's interest in agroforestry dates to his work as a Peace Corps volunteer in Swaziland. His involvement in agroforestry in the Southwest began in 2017. He is a founding member and immediate past chair of the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network. Hi, Jim. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Abby. Thank you.
Wonderful. We are so happy to have you on the show today. Today, as your bio might have led people to believe, we are talking about agroforestry and specifically food forests. So there are kind of a lot of related, similar terms in this space. So to get us started, can you walk us through terms like food forests, agroforests, urban agroforests, and permaculture, and just lay out what are the differences between these terms and in what scenarios they might best be used?
Sure, be happy to. Before that, though, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on the paper that we're talking about. His name is Andy Mason, and he was the director of the USDA National Agroforestry Center. He retired and moved down to Arizona, and we met here. And a lot of the food forest visits that I'll talk about were with Andy, and Andy helped set them up for me in some cases. So I just wanted to acknowledge Andy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy.
Getting to your question, though, first of all, what is a food forest? To me, a food forest is a type of polyculture, meaning that involves growing more than one crop in the same place at the same time. Food forests often have a lot of species, in some cases dozens of species growing all together. Many of those, really the majority of them, are perennial species, meaning that they're long-lived species, they're not annuals. And sometimes you see definitions of food forests that talk about them having multiple layers, like 7 or even 9 layers. For example, they may have an overstory, a canopy with large trees. They could be large fruit or nut trees, or they could be timber trees. Then you may have mid-story with smaller fruit trees, and you may have shrub layer with things like currants. You can have a herbaceous layer. You can have a rhizosphere or root crop layer. You can have soil surface plants. You can have vertical layers like grapes climbing up the trees. And you can even have like an aquatic layer, a small pond, for example, or you can talk about a fungi layer, mushrooms and things of that sort. So they can be really complex in terms of numbers of species and number of layers of vegetation. Really fascinating looking places. Sometimes they go by other names. Quite often in our region, like the temperate regions of the world, we talk about them as forest gardens. But if you go into the tropical regions, you might hear them referred to as tropical home gardens or agroforests. So to me, they're all synonyms, really. You could subdivide them a little bit, maybe by size, but to me, they're really all the same. They're complex, multi-layered plantings of mostly perennial species. And then I think you mentioned urban agroforestry. So to me, food forests are just one type of agroforestry practice. And when we say urban agroforestry, we're just talking about agroforestry in towns and cities and suburbs and things like that. Agroforestry itself is really the combination of trees with crops and or livestock. And there's all these different practices. And at least theoretically, all those practices could be done in the cities. Like you could have riparian buffers in cities. You could have alley cropping in cities. But in reality, space is limited in cities. And I think that food forests make particularly good applications because they fit into really small spaces. And then when we talk about food forests, often the word permaculture comes up. And to me, that's a little bit of a trickier thing to define. At the most simple level, you could talk about it as the combination of permanence and agriculture. I mean, that's where the name comes from, permanent and agriculture. And for most people, that means a perennial-based type of agriculture. And food forests are a great example of something that fits into permaculture. But really, it's a more broad kind of thing. You could talk about it as a design system based on different principles and different sets of ethics. And I don't know that we want to get into that in much detail, but regardless, food forests and permaculture often kind of go hand in hand.
Sure. I have a question about this aquatic layer. So is it trying to provide food in some way with, like, I don't know, rice or watercress or fish, or is it more just to help water the garden and kind of support the biodiversity and, garden at large, I guess?
It's a great question, and I guess the short answer is all of the above.
Okay.
There are examples of it producing food, like you said, which could include fish or aquatic plants. It definitely enhances the biodiversity of a food forest. It can be a source of water. You can store water and then use it if you need it. You can even use it to fight fires. There's an example of that.
Oh, wow.
And so it can provide multiple benefits, including aesthetics. It's really just very pleasant to have a water feature within your food forest.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the aesthetics and the benefits, because as you were talking, I was like, wow, this just sounds like this nice, in an urban environment specifically, like this nice escape from like the hustle and bustle where you can just go hang out in this little oasis of nature's beauty. But aside from the aesthetics, there's also a lot of other benefits that we wanted to talk about today. So what, besides food, obviously, and kind of that aesthetic relaxation element, what are some of the other benefits of having these forests around?
There's a pretty long list, and it includes tangible products. So you mentioned food, and there's quite a range of food you can produce in a food forest. But you can also produce medicinal plants. You can produce wood. You can produce forage. So there's these kind of tangible products that you can produce, in some cases that you can sell. There are quite a range of ecological services they perform. They can sequester carbon. On a per unit area, it seems like they sequester quite a lot. We can talk about that more if you want. They can enhance biodiversity and also this subcategory called agrobiodiversity, where maybe you have rare varieties of certain plants and things of that sort. They can help cool that local climate, which is really important in this part of the world where I live, in the Southwest. In some cases, if you have them right up against your house, you can reduce the energy costs, say, from heating in a region like ours. There's the commercial potential associated with producing food and products like tinctures and things of that sort. And there's social benefits. You kind of mentioned one, this environment where you can just go in and relax and feel comfortable. But there's other benefits. It can improve food security to some degree. It can enhance food literacy, so people are more aware of where food comes from, they appreciate it more, things like that. It's a form of green infrastructure. You can hold back stormwater in a food forest that otherwise would wash into the streets and maybe into sewage treatment plants where it has to be treated. They're a great educational resource. You can bring kids from a local school there, talk about food forests, you can talk about where food comes from, things like that. So there's so many benefits. And to me, food forests in some ways are about health. They're about health because you're producing really healthy, local, fresh food, for example. You're improving the ecological health of an area. And I think they're great examples where it even improves the health of a whole community. And that's something that I'd be happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, I mean, go for it. I agree, and I'm curious to know your viewpoint on that.
To me, my favorite example of that is what's going on in Tucson in a neighborhood called the Dunbar Spring. And this is a lower income neighborhood. And back in the 90s, a person named Brad Lancaster and his brother Rod moved into this neighborhood. They bought a house on an 1/8-acre lot. It was a pretty degraded house. And out in front of pretty much all the homes in this neighborhood, there's this kind of wide, like 20-foot wide area between the private property and the street. It's a public right-of-way. And in most cases, it's just completely bare and compacted. People parking their cars on it and everything. And they started planting in their own yard. They extended the plantings into that public right-of-way. They started reaching out to the neighbors and getting them interested in doing the plantings as well. And now if you go into that neighborhood for blocks in every direction, you'll see these plantings in the public rights-of-way, in people's yards. And mixed in with the plantings are walkways, there's artwork like sculptures and murals, and it's really enhanced the attractiveness of that community. Supposedly it's lowered crime because people are in the streets more, they're interacting, they get to know each other more. They have neighborhood gatherings to plant and prune the trees and to dig the basins that they plant them in. And it really has improved that whole entire neighborhood. And that's what I mean by improving the health and the attractiveness of a neighborhood, starting with trees, starting with managing rainwater, and expanding to art and community gatherings and things of that sort.
Wow, I love that story. It's so just wholesome and uplifting. Yeah, I think those are some great benefits. And then there's also one that you kind of touched on a little bit about talking how it cools things down a little bit, and that's combating the heat island effect. So can you explain what that is and how food forests help to fight it?
Sure, absolutely. So most cities, no matter where they are, they tend to be hotter than the surrounding rural environments. This is because of all the concrete, all the roads, all the cars, all that kind of stuff that generates heat and concentrates that heat. And to some degree, that heat's kept in the city by tall buildings that lower the wind, and so that heat doesn't disperse as much. And so cities are often 5, 10, sometimes even more degrees warmer than surrounding rural areas, especially rural areas that have a lot of greenery, have trees and other kind of plants that provide shade. And so one thing we can do in urban areas is to plant more trees. And we can do that as food forests. We could do that as street trees and in any number of different ways. And when we do that, we create cooler sort of microenvironments, microclimates. And if we do that on a big enough scale, we can offer considerable relief from heat stress. And in places like Phoenix and Tucson, every year we have deaths, we have hospitalizations because of heat stress. And often that heat stress is highest in lower income areas, which tend to have less trees to start with. And so there are certain areas where I think we should really concentrate our efforts in trying to combat this urban heat island effect. And food forest is just one tool we can use, but it's a tool that provides all these other benefits along with the shade and the reduction in temperature.
Absolutely. That sounds like a really important benefit in particular. So then for this specific project, you were looking at food forests specifically in the Southwest United States, and you were kind of doing, trying to do a bit of ground truthing as to what was out there already. So can you talk to me about that project and kind of how you went about it?
Absolutely. So I've lived in this region for about 15 years. Well, most of that time I've been an administrator, haven't had any time at all for research. But back in 2017, I took a one semester sabbatical. And one of the goals was to kind of see what was going on in this region in the way of agroforestry. This is something that I got interested in the Peace Corps, really hadn't done much since then. So there was about a 25-year gap between when I'd done work involving agroforestry and my work here, including this food forest work. But in my travels, I'd seen some examples and was beginning to get very intrigued about the possibilities of agroforestry more generally. And so we decided, and by then I had met Andy Mason, we decided to start going out and seeing what we could find in terms of food forests specifically. We knew of some already, and so we contacted those folks and arranged for visits. And then from that, it kind of snowballed into other visits. And our goals were really limited. Our goals were just see what we could find, interview these creators of these food forests, these managers, learn what they were doing, why they were doing it, what challenges they were facing, what contributions maybe we could make as researchers, things like that. It was really just a first cut look at what's being done already. And it was really a fascinating and very enjoyable thing to do, to visit all these food forests. And we hope it will set the stage for additional research, more in-depth research that, say, maybe I will do or students here at NAU will do, or that others may be inspired to do as well.
I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Jim's paper, Urban Food Forests in the American Southwest, published in Urban Agriculture and Regional Food Systems, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gasmet Technologies and Meter Group. For Gasmet Technologies, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork weighing 20.7 pounds. The GT5000 Terra is splash-proof IP54 rated with an internal pump and battery, and instantaneous readings of up to 50 gases at sub-ppm concentrations. Check out the quick setup guide and learn more about Gasmet Technologies at www.gasmet.com and the links in the show notes. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, sounds like getting to do field trips to food forests for fieldwork sounds really, really pleasant.
It was great to get out of the office, believe me.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. And what lovely places to visit. So
absolutely.
So what did you find then across these different food forests?
Well, first of all, we managed to find a pretty good number of them. And we visited 15 food forests or potential food forests, one of which we decided didn't really meet the criteria. It just wasn't complex enough. But one thing that fascinated me was the range of environments we found these things in. And when I say the range of environments, there's all these different ways you can look at that. One is elevation. You know, here in the Southwest, we have low deserts. Places like Tucson and Phoenix are at relatively low elevations, hot desert environments. And then we got up as high as 7,200 feet up in Colorado. And we saw beautiful food forests in each of these areas, each of these elevational ranges. We also found them in people's backyards. We found them in intentional communities like co-housing projects. We found them in permaculture centers. We found them at a public library. So they occur in all these different kinds of properties in all these different physical environments. And to me, that was really fascinating to see that kind of range of food forests in terms of the environments, both kind of the social environment and the physical environment.
And then I know you were looking at a few things like how big they were, how old they were, why they were started, as well as the structure of it and like how many plants they had there, how they were dealing with some of the issues that are kind of more specific to that region, such as, you know, getting enough water, soil quality, compaction, things like that. Can you talk a bit about your results across those criteria?
Sure. So first of all, most of them were relatively young. The oldest food forests we found were established in the 1980s. And from what we can tell, this is a growing phenomenon in this region. In other words, there's an increasing number of these food forests. And these older ones are great examples of what's possible. Most of them are really small, less than an acre in size. Some of them much less than an acre in size. And they range in their degree of complexity. When I say that, I'm talking about, do they have all those 7 or 9 layers? How many species do they have? Things like that. Some of the older ones are just absolutely gorgeous places to go in. They have little winding networks of paths that work their way through them. There's trees overhead. There's, you know, berries right at hand at your own eye level. So you see a range of complexity, but the older ones tend to be more fully developed in that regard. There are a lot of challenges in this region, water probably being the single biggest one. We saw some really creative examples of using water. Almost all of them use rainwater to some degree. Besides just letting the rain fall on the food forest, they're harvesting that rain in cisterns. They're keeping it from running off the property with swales where the water gathers up against little berms and often infiltrates. There's rainwater retention basins, things like that. So there's this really significant effort to make use of the rainwater and to concentrate rainwater on the plants. That person I mentioned earlier, Brad Lancaster, he talks about planting the rain. First thing you do is plant the rain, then you plant the plants. And to me, that's a great concept for the Southwest in particular, to think about how you're going to use rainwater. But we also saw some really interesting examples of using gray water. For example, routing water from showers, from sinks, from washing machines directly out into these food forests. At Brad's place, I think is my favorite example. He has a washing machine that's in a little outdoor shed, and the pipe that normally would just go into the sewer system, he can take that pipe and put it into a series of other pipes. So from the back of his washing machine, he can pull out that drain pipe and hook it up to another pipe that says orange tree or sapote tree or whatever. And so he can take that pipe after one washing, take it out, put it in the next pipe, water the next tree. So you can do some really creative things.
Oh, I love that.
And another, I think really creative example is harvesting rain right off the street. So in that same neighborhood, there's a lot of these curb cores or curb cuts. So holes in the curb or just a section of the curb cut out. And then when you get a big rain, big monsoon like we have down here, you got water just rushing down the street and right into storm drains normally, where it might have to go into a sewage treatment plant. But in that neighborhood, a lot of the water goes into retention basins in those public rights-of-way. So once it hits a curb cut or curb core, it diverts into that basin where they have trees planted and shrubs planted, things like that. So they're intercepting water right off the street.
Wow. That's great.
It is. There are some food forests that use flood irrigation or groundwater pumping as well. But what really inspires me is to see how people use rainwater in this region. So I mentioned water as a challenge. Another challenge that we heard a lot about was the soil. And there were a range of challenges there. There was heavy clay soil. There was the caliche soil that you see in a lot of desert environments where you get this really concrete, almost like layer, kind of a hard pan layer caused by calcium carbonates. And there's compaction. So some pretty challenging soils to deal with if you're going to plant trees in these environments. And we saw a range of different ways to deal with that. Sometimes we're talking about just kind of breaking through those hard layers with a digging fork or some other tool. In almost every case, we saw a lot of organic material being added to the soils, usually just placed right on top. And from there, nature kind of takes its course and decays that and builds up organic matter. One thing we learned about, for example, was that people would just request drop-offs of landscaping debris. So you have a arborist in your neighborhood cutting and chipping trees. They might dump that whole truckload in your driveway and you can spread it out and build up the organic matter that way. That's a way to deal with the soil. That's a way to help hold soil moisture. So there are ways like that to improve the quality of the soil. And it's really amazing to go into a food forest that's more than just 2 or 3 years old and look at the soil there. It's so much different than, say, in the next yard over in terms of the amount of organic matter, the evidence of mycorrhizal fungi, things like that. Usually because of adding organic matter, sometimes from external sources, sometimes using species that they talk about as chop and drop, where you grow something, you cut it and use it as mulch. So there are ways to improve the soil, even in really rough environments like downtown Phoenix, for example, or downtown Tucson. And then biodiversity is an important goal, or at least an important benefit of many of these food forests. And there's not a lot of data to back this up, but if you walk into one of these older food forests, you just know that it's improving the biodiversity. There's quite a bit more bird life, for example, insect life. It just seems like there's a lot more biodiversity. I'd love to see that documented, but I don't think your eyes lie in a case like that. If you spend time just sitting quietly in a food forest, you'll notice a lot of birds and a lot of other life, even in an urban area. And then, of course, there's the biodiversity of all the plants that you're planting. In some cases, there's over 100 species in these food forests. And then there's the issue of why people do this. And we heard different reasons, but in most cases, I would say that it comes about because of an interest in permaculture and an interest in sustainability more generally. What I think happens is that people get this interest in environmental issues, sustainability issues, that leads them to permaculture. They might even take a formal course, like a permaculture design course. The next thing you know, they're planting a food forest or something very similar to a food forest. So they have these goals that are about sustainability, about improving their local environment, educating others. To some degree, it's a commercial thing, but mostly what I saw were non-commercial motives that have a lot to do with environmental sustainability, improving lifestyles, improving your own neighborhood, improving your own yard, things of that sort. That seemed to be the sort of primary motivation.
Sure. Passion projects.
It's very much a passion project. Some people even call it a romantic sort of thing, but it has these tangible benefits that go along with it, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. Great. Well, I'm so glad that we got to talk about, all of these different things that you found doing this survey. You also kind of explored some of the obstacles that can prevent people from starting or maintaining these. Obviously, you have to, plant your rain first and figure out some of those more practical issues. But what are some of the other obstacles that food foresters might face, be that specific to your region or more globally? What are some of the challenges there?
I think the biggest obstacle to what I would call adoption or having more people do these kind of things is just a lack of knowledge about them, a lack of awareness. When you mention food forests to most people, they have no idea what you're talking about. And if they start to learn about it, they may be intimidated by what's involved in terms of maybe they don't have a lot of knowledge of planting and tending, say, fruit trees or other kind of plants. So there's kind of a knowledge barrier. For some people, there may be a barrier associated with the cost. I don't know if you've ever gone to a nursery, you probably have. If you want to buy 40 or 50 fruit trees and get started on a food forest, it's going to run you a lot of money if you buy them from a nursery, where each one may cost you $40 or even $100. And so there are costs involved. There are ways around those costs. You can learn how to propagate more of your own plants, for example, using grafting, using cuttings, things of that sort. You can exchange plants if you're in a network with others. So you can find ways around the cost, but there are going to be costs for sure. There's going to be physical work. Planting is not easy work. Weeding may not be easy work. Pruning, all those kinds of things, they need to be done. So there are those kind of barriers. There may be barriers to just having a place to do the work, having some land, in other words, having access to water, things of that sort. I've seen some creative workarounds, like places where you plant in public rights-of-way or even traffic circles or schools or other public buildings. So there are these options to work around them, but they are barriers. There may be attitudes about them as well. It's kind of interesting to go to a neighborhood where you see a really mature, well-developed food forest, and then you look around at all the other houses, and they look just like traditional suburban lots. They may just be gravel, they may be grass lawns, they may have just a couple of ornamental trees, and you kind of wonder, why aren't they doing the same thing as this neighbor who's shown what's possible and what can be done? And so there may be attitudes, there may be skepticism, there may be things like that we need to understand a little better. But there's so many examples of successful food forests and people overcoming these obstacles that, to me, it's really about knowledge. It's about encouraging people to think this way and to give it a try.
Sure. Makes sense to me. Okay, so then we kind of touched on this a little bit when we were talking about the biodiversity, but what are some future areas of research for food forests at large? How can we document what we need to document or make these easier for people to do, get the education out there? Where are we headed with food forests?
We need a lot more research. In this region, there's hardly any work that's been done to date on food forests. But in a lot of places, I think you can pretty much say the same. That research is really just getting underway in a lot of cases. I would say there's more research in the tropics than there is in the temperate region. And to me, research needs fall into, I guess, three main categories. First, I think we need a lot more work of the kind that Andy and I did, just kind of formal surveys. We need to know how many of them are out there and where are they? Who's doing it? What are their goals? We got to start on those kinds of things, but we reported on 14 of them. I'd like to see surveys that include dozens or even hundreds of food forests. We just need more effort, more time, more resources to go out and find them and to do these kind of things like we did in more detail. But then there's a whole range of biophysical research that we could be doing. What kind of productivity are we getting out of these food forests in terms of actual products like foods and medicines, etc.? What about the overall biomass productivity, carbon sequestration? How much water are they really using and where is it coming from? And can we be more efficient in using water? What kind of impacts are they really having on the soil? I mentioned sort of these anecdotal observational kinds of things. Let's document it. Let's document the carbon sequestering in the soil. Same thing with climate amelioration. You walk into a food forest, you feel cooler. Let's document the actual impacts on things like temperature. So there's this whole range of biophysical work that we could do. And then there's socioeconomic research. You asked about barriers. There are definitely barriers. What are they? How can we get around them? We've only just begun to think about that, really. What about the effects on the community? To me, they're very positive. The example I mentioned of the Dunbar Spring neighborhood, generally a very positive benefit. A potential downside is, are you gentrifying that neighborhood to the point where you're impacting the current residents? What do we know about that? How is it affecting property values? It almost certainly is impacting the property values in that neighborhood in a positive way. At least for some people, I would say that's a positive thing. And then we're in a culturally diverse area. And what is the cultural importance of food forests, say, to Native Americans or Hispanic populations or just low-income neighborhoods in Phoenix or Tucson or Farmington or Las Vegas? So there's a lot of interesting socioeconomic research that could be done as well. When it comes to sort of the biophysical, sort of agricultural type research, I really wonder what we can do that's practical. If you're talking about annual crops, you can do replicated, randomized block studies, things of that sort. I'm not sure you're going to see that anytime soon with food forests, and that's going to make some of the research that I'd like to see difficult in terms of the statistical rigor of that research.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If they're all so different, it's not like you can make the same one more than one place.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of need, a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges for researchers. But I really want to see researchers get more involved in food forests and permaculture, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sounds like there is loads to be done. So that's very exciting to have this kind of newer frontier, I guess. I have 3 questions left for you. One question is, if people want to learn more about anything that we've talked about today, where can they go?
Well, one thing I would encourage people to do, I would suggest that you Google or search with some other search engine, put in food forests and put in your town, put in where you live. see what comes up. You might be surprised by what you find. Chances are you'll find some videos. You may find a local permaculture network or food forest network. And if you do, contact those folks. Get in touch with them. Go see what they're doing on the ground. Also, you might reach out to your local extension service or get involved in a program like Master Gardeners where you can develop skills that you could apply. There are also quite a few books on the topic. I'll send you a list of books and also some videos that I find really helpful and also really inspiring. And so there are an increasing number of resources. In the paper that Andy and I wrote, we have a table that lists some local sort of web-based resources, organizations in this region. And so if you're in the Southwest, I hope you'll get that paper, look at that table, click on the links, and check out some of our kind of local networks. So there are a fair number of sources out there, and they seem to be increasing almost every day in terms of web-based resources, books, videos, things of that sort.
Wonderful. We will include links to all of that in our show notes. Second question is, if people then want to take that next step and get involved in food forests, how can they get started?
Well, I would encourage them to look around. If they own property, start thinking about what they could do on their own property. Principle number one in permaculture is to observe. Before you do anything else, take some time and observe the land that you want to work with. Get to know where the sun comes up, where the sun goes down, where there's shading during the day, things like that. So really begin to look around at a place that you might be able to do this kind of work and begin to understand it. Take some training, take the Master Gardener training or things like that. Volunteer if there's a tree planting maintenance project, something like that in your neighborhood or in your city. All those are places where you can kind of get your hands dirty, get started before you commit to your own project.
All right. Final question. What is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Yeah, that's a good question. Been working for 21 years as an administrator, 60 hours a week. Hard to develop much of a set of hobbies or things like that, I guess you could say. But one thing that's kind of related to what we've been talking about and that I'm really excited about, and it's not research, is a project that we're doing at a place called Arco Santi, which is a intentional community, kind of an experimental urban community located about halfway between here and Phoenix, so about 80 miles south of Flagstaff. And I definitely encourage you to Google Arco Santi. It's just a very unique place. It draws something like 20,000 visitors a year from all over the world. The goal there is to kind of combine kind of unique architecture and ecology and sustainability in a way where you can live and work in the same environment and ideally produce a lot of your own food and energy in that same environment. So it's just a really fascinating place. And recently they decided they wanted to try to kind of revitalize their agriculture. It kind of lapsed in this 50-year-old community. And they got wind of this term agroforestry. And by hook or crook, they made contact with me. And we started talking about food forests and alley cropping and things like that. And now we've been developing a food forest. Got it through one growing season, just getting going. But already over 100 different people have come to see it and to work in it. And that includes like AmeriCorps volunteers, students from Yavapai College and NAU. Quite a few different people have been there already to see just this beginning of a food forest. And so for me, it's been fun to get my hands dirty and to kind of learn, the practical issues by doing as opposed to talking to others, and doing it in a very unique and beautiful environment. So that's what I have to say about a fun fact related to me.
That is a very fun fact. That sounds very cool. I will for sure check that out. And if we find any good links, we'll put them in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate having you on the show, and best wishes on Arcosanti and whatever else you're working on. It sounds like you're doing a lot of good stuff.
I'm trying. And thank you so much, Abby. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Paul. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me today to speak about my research in the field of soil health. I'm Paul Benalcázar. I'm an agronomist, and my passion is about soil and water studies for agriculture. From the field work techniques and to the remote sensing techniques from the bottom-up perspective. My aim is to find better ways to save energy and improve sustainable practice in those two key resources, soil and water, for agriculture.
Wonderful. And can you tell us about your current research project?
Oh, yes. So my research is about assessing soil health indicators in boreal forests since the conversion from boreal forest to agriculture. So I'm studying right now at Lakehead University in a city called Thunder Bay in northwestern Ontario. To have an idea where I am, so I am 18 hours driving from Toronto, and we are close to Lake Superior in the northwestern side and limited with the boreal forest.
Wonderful. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
Oh, I would like to have big research stations in which I see and I can look for characteristics like water and soil and merge the traditional ecological knowledge and the scientific knowledge for improving practice in the north.
Wonderful. If you'd like to get in touch with Paul about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.